The floor is to you.
Thanks, Beckham. So this lecture is titled Health Factories. So let's go. The Ring of Brodgar is a Neolithic henge and stone circle in Hackney, Scotland. And the circle spans 104 meters and sits within a carved sandstone ditch. It is a part of a broader Neolithic complex of buildings, standing stones, and burial cairns. And this is reality. While the exact purpose of the circle is unknown, the site clearly held deep spiritual significance. And in order to understand Ring of Brodgar, we can look at perception, space, and dwelling as three components of an interconnected sequence of human activity. In Maurice Merleau-Ponty's philosophical framework, consciousness has a transcendental quality existing beyond its immediate boundaries. And the term transcendental refers to extending one's perception beyond oneself, beyond the confines of the individual mental representations. And illustrating this concept, Merleau-Ponty employs the metaphor of a shining light. And consciousness is linked to a luminous spot that shines a beam of light outward, illuminating the objects encountered in the external world. And in the traditional dualistic view, the mind is detached from matter, and consciousness duplicates material objects as mental images. And Merleau-Ponty argues that there is no distinction between the two. Our consciousness is already embedded in the reality it perceives. In 1953, Anton Ehrenswijk explained distortions in paintings by Paul Cézanne as alterations in his peripheral vision brought about by the static eye, which is the artist's method of fixating on other points in the scene for prolonged periods of time. And his paintings show how an artist's consciousness extends out to illuminate the landscape and translate it into the art object. And looking at this work titled Still Life with Apples and a Pot of Primroses, we can notice that the painting distorts towards the edges, away from the artist's focal point, where the stalks of the leaves begin to disappear. And we can see similar distortions in other works by the artist. And this is reality as mediated through perception. This already suggests that space is not metaphysically foundational. It is the consequence of the tendency of the mind to abstract parts of the whole. In Henry Bergson's philosophy, perception tends to diminish the material object based on the function that this object could serve for us. The reality of matter consists in the totality of its elements and of their actions of every kind, and our representation of matter is the measure of our possible actions upon bodies. It results from the discarding of what has no interest for our needs, or more generally for our functions, from Matter and Memory by Henry Bergson. So, for example, we might see the chair as a piece of furniture to sit on if we are tired, therefore cutting off all of the other qualities of the chair. In the other moment in time, we might see the same chair as an object that has to be moved because it stands in our way. And this is the way to move freely through the world and satisfy our daily needs. Alexander Archipenko is a Ukrainian artist whose work aligns closely with Bergson's philosophy, and the sculptures he creates break this habitual perception that Bergson describes, the substitution of what is already known for what is presented to the eye. And looking at the femme marchante, or the woman walking, we are forced to constantly conduct intellectual work, identifying shapes and drawing connections between them to form a woman's figure. So the idea that the mind, forms of pure space, is only the schema of the limit at which the movement would end. Once in possession of the form of space, mind uses it like a net of meshes that can be made and unmade at will, which, thrown over matter, divides it as the needs of our action demand, from Creative Evolution by Henry Bergson. So we are never able to grasp the world in its totality, and life is a process of constant creation and constant construction of alternative reality, which is not a duplicate, but rather a mesh woven into the material reality, and this is space. This mental process brings about the need to stabilize this constructed space into material form, and such stabilization happens through dwelling. In his essay, Building Dwelling Thinking, Martin Heidegger traces the old German word bauen, or to build, to its older sense, to dwell, to remain, to inhabit a place. So dwelling is not merely an activity, but a fundamental condition of human existence. And dwelling is a mode of being in the world, and dwelling is maintaining a meaningful connection to the world, and without it, life becomes rootless and empty. That is the definition of dwelling I will use throughout the lecture. So the way in which you are and I am, the manner in which we humans are on the earth is dwelling, from Martin Heidegger, Building Dwelling Thinking. So in his essay, Heidegger explores an idea of gathering the earth as landscape through dwelling. The bridge swings over the stream with ease and power. It does not just connect banks that are already there. The banks emerge as banks only as the bridge crosses the stream, from his essay. So coming back to the beginning of this lecture, the Ring of Brodgar, we can now read it as an embodiment of the landscape itself, a dwelling, a place where Neolithic people could materialize a space they have constructed. Ring of Brodgar lies in the center of mainland Orkney. The site sits in the natural amphitheater, surrounded by hills on the horizon and two large lakes on either side, saltwater loch of Stennis and the freshwater loch of Hray. The moon and the sun appear to orbit the ring, rising and setting at precise notches on the horizon. The stones of the ring were dragged from multiple local quarries scattered across the Orkney landscape. Positioned at the gravitational center of the landscape, the structure is space-made material. It gathers the earth, translating a circular vision of the landscape into physical form, and the stone circle reflects reality as mediated through human perception. And this is dwelling. So in some instances, although not all, dwelling can become a home. If dwelling materializes a human understanding of reality, then home preserves this understanding through memory and habit. The house shelters daydreaming, the house protects the dreamer, and the house allows one to dream in peace, from The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard. And according to Bachelard, before we have a chance to encounter the world, we are laid in the cradle of the house. The home is where our life begins, and it is a form where all our later experiences of the world are measured. He believes that the attic holds our most lucid memories, while the dark, mysterious cellar is a repository of our primitive and unconscious fears. Corners provide an intimate space for solitude, and windows frame our own unique perspective on the exterior landscape. He concludes that throughout our lives we have many homes, each of which we continue to inhabit in our imagination. Although Bachellard's account focuses on the intimacy of rooms, attics, corners, and cellars, these spaces derive their meaning from a wider world. If I connect back to Heidegger on this definition of dwelling, the landscape that the home gathers, the familiar path, garden, and hill on the horizon, becomes an inseparable component of the home, a part of the world through which one understands themselves. So this is home. And this brings about a political question. If human beings constitute their world through dwelling, can that world become the object of intervention? And as we have seen, this system maintains itself through time. It is a living organism that requires an underpinning belief to continue to exist. However, if the system's foundations were to be retrospectively intervened with, and the connection between the previously established reality and perception broken, how might everything in the cause and effect chain that follows be changed? Very few states pursued such an intervention as systematically as the Soviet Union. Beginning in the 20th century, it reframed the concept of nature through the lens of medicine. It used this to legitimize the construction of sanatoriums, health resorts, and youth camps to re-educate, heal, and increase the productivity of its workforce. And the sanatorium thus represents an attempt to reorganize the very environment through which dwelling took place. And we can trace the development of this concept of nature through three key stages. The first one, April 4th, 1919, Lenin signs the decree on the curative regions of state significance, nationalizing health resorts and placing them under Narkomnadzdrav for medicinal purposes. Second stage is July 5th, 1930. Narkomnadzdrav issues a formal definition of the health resort sanatorium as a stationary clinical prophylactic institution where treatments with natural factors like climate, mineral waters, mud, and kumis are administered under physician supervision. And the definition mandates balconies, terraces, large windows, and ventilation, architectural features designed to facilitate the cure. And the third stage is June 1st, 1959. Council of Ministers Decree number 590 launches the mass construction of sanatoria, houses of relaxation, and kurortные городки, or health resort settlements, meant for mass access. So we can trace the parallel progression in the Soviet landscape painting through the 20th century. So two approaches dominated the official art scene, particularly during the Stalin era: the industrial landscape and the agricultural landscape. The industrial landscape emerged first, depicting industrial objects like factories, railways, and construction sites as an organic part of the landscape. And the agricultural landscape presented nature itself as a productive factory. The land was shown as a space for heroic deeds, the greatness of the Soviet motherland, and the authorities arranging for the battle for the harvest. So the policies of health in the 1920s were focused on the raw power of nature. The concept of zakaливание, or hardening, became central to Soviet preventive medicine. Exposure to cold air, sun, and water was understood to train the nervous system and increase disease resistance. And following that era, under Stalin's rule, we can see a major shift in the narrative as the state began its project of osvoyение, or improvement. The civilizing power of socialism had to be demonstrated, and resorts became the key sites for such a cultured landscape. As the newspaper Pravda, Truth, declared in 1934, the modern resort equals nature plus culture. This was park-like architectural landscape. The medicinal narrative was no longer about zakaливание, hardening, but refinement. The patient was cultured through exposure to a constructed landscape. So the state thought to intervene in the system, changing how nature was perceived. And the Soviet government launched a number of extensive projects in land improvement and hydroengineering to eliminate malaria. Swamps were drained and rivers were straightened. in Sochi, hundreds of thousands of exotic trees were planted to transform the indigenous forest into a subtropical landscape, rivaling Miami and French Riviera. And the great plan for the transformation of nature was conceived by Stalin in the late 1940s. And in this period, the sanatorium transformed from a place of rest to a highly curated health factory, a total institution where every aspect of patients' life was scheduled and medicalized in the service of turning them into a more productive, cultured, and ideologically sound Soviet citizen. And the architectural features of these places corresponded to the policies. Balconies and terraces were attached to every room, facing south to maximize sun exposure, roof solaria and aeraria, open-air treatment halls for sun and air baths, large windows and sliding walls to blur the boundary between the indoors and the outdoors, verandas and lodges for the lying cure or patients resting in the fresh air. The tight schedule, also called sanatorium regime, was designed to enforce hygiene, mandatory exposure to nature, and physical and mental discipline. Patients were allowed in their rooms only at certain times, with the rest having to be spent in the open air. And below is a typical daily schedule from the Stalin period, circa 1952, provided by the Sochi Administration of Trade Union Sanatorium. So we have rising at 7:30 a.m., morning gymnastics 7:40, breakfast at 8, medical procedures from 8 to 9:30, mass sports 12 to 3 p.m., lunch from 3 to 4, mandatory rest hour 3:30 to 5, tea 5 to 5:30, dinner 7 to 8:30, mass cultural events 5 to 7, and the lights were out by 11:30. Patients of the sanatorium were forbidden from storing belongings in their rooms, wearing outdoor clothes inside, or eating in bed. Luggage was stored in a separate room, and patients were given pajamas and slippers upon arrival. This was done to enforce hygiene, but also to depersonalize the room and push social lives into public space. The regime ensured patients were outdoors no less than 4 hours each day, whether through gymnastics, sports, walks, or lying in the aerarium. Even the rest hour was often taken on outdoor terraces. Mandatory medical procedures were integrated into the daily schedule: sunbathing, prescribed walks of specialized lengths and speed, sulfur baths, and individual prescriptions. The sanatorium claimed to heal its patients through exposure to landscape aesthetics. Views of the sea, the scent of flowers, and the sound of birds were considered therapeutic. And as the architect V.A. Kutsenko wrote in 1954, the beauty of nature is treated as one of the healing factors, acting through the modulation of psychic emotions on the organism. The Stalin era also demonstrates a shift from an earlier passive patient to an active rester. The sanatorium was no longer for the sick, but it was for the healthy who needed to repair to return to work stronger. In the 1950s, after Stalin's death, the narrative turned to mass access. The garden-like sanatoria were criticized as ostentatious, serving the elites, Stahanovits, engineers, scientists, generals, and prominent party members. And following a series of public surveys that revealed an overwhelming desire to rest in nature, the state began the construction of sanatorium complexes, or kurortные городки. It was a public health landscape. Instead of treating individual patients, the state now managed the health of the entire population. Soviet policies conceptualized nature, linking landscape to medicine and medicine to the state's control over the individual's behavior, thoughts, and body. And in Security, Territory, and Population by Michel Foucault, He refers to the concept of milieu as a certain number of combined overall effects bearing on all who live in it. The milieu appears as a field of intervention in which, instead of affecting individuals as a set of legal subjects capable of voluntary actions, one tries to affect precisely a population. So, unlike Foucault's earlier work on discipline, where the behavior was forced, security modifies the environment under which such behavior occurs. One of Foucault's points is that security does not command outcomes directly, and instead it structures conditions so that certain behaviors become more likely. And the sanatorium changes nature from the field of dwelling into an infrastructure that is meant to produce the desired behavior. The book Sick Architecture, edited by Beatrix Colomina, explores this idea of the pure civilization and sick nature, rooted in the impulse to shelter from natural forces and culminating in the contemporary architecture of health. And in the Soviet approach, we can see something slightly different. Equating desire, materialism, laziness, and chaos of the self with physical illness, the state juxtaposes the individual with the purifying force of nature, which in turn must be engineered by the state. Resters were taught to use air, water, and sun to cleanse their bodies. However, nature becomes therapeutic only after it was improved by the state. Through prescribed views, walks, sunbaths, the state intervenes in the conditions through which people relate to their environment. And the refusal to engage with the regime of the sanatorium was seen not only as a refusal to participate in the socialist project, but as an antisocial and uncultured behavior that goes against the undeniable aesthetics, purity, and morality of nature. And a healthy person was not only free of maladies, but they were also rational, productive, cultured, and disciplined. And this framing allows us to see the sanatorium project as an intervention into the milieu. Through the propaganda of health, the Soviet government attempted to redesign the relationships between humans and nature, reorganizing the world that home embodied and transforming it before any physical damage occurs. And I will end on this image of sunset over the Ring of Brodgar. Thank you.